In today's lesson, we will be looking at circle graphs. The three different kinds of circle graphs that we will be looking at are graphs that have numbers or totals, graphs that have fractions like down here, and graphs that have percents. The really great thing about circle graphs is they give you a lot of information just in a picture. Here we can see by looking at this graph that the majority of the money was spent on bills because we can see that bills has the biggest section. A circle graph tells you the part out of a total. Here the part is a percentage, 40%, out of the total 100% of the graph. Let's take a look at a few examples. The first example tells us, by looking at the graph, the amount of money that's spent to run a computer lab. We can see that the graph tells us the total amount of money, and then each of the parts here will tell us the amount of money that's spent. The question asks, what percent of the computer lab's expenses were paper supplies? So our focus needs to be on paper supplies. By writing a part over a total, we can easily find the percent. So if we can figure out what part of the money was spent out of the total amount of money, we can easily change that into a percentage. Let's try it. The part of the money that was spent on paper supplies is $775. That's the part. The total amount that was spent is $1,936. So if we take 775 and divide it by 1,396, we can find the percent. When I use the calculator to divide, I get 0.400309917. It continues to go on. I want to change this to a percentage. I move the decimal point 2 places to the right, and I get about 40%. Now I could round out to the tenths or the hundredths, but look at the decimal place right after. I see that digit's a 0. So it's pretty safe to say that this is approximately 40%. So it looks like about 40% of the money was spent on paper supplies. On this next example, we can see that students were surveyed as to which sport they play. We're asked what percent of the students surveyed played football. Football, you can see, is in the pink, so right here. Now again, just like the last example, we can find percent by finding the part over the total and changing that to a percent, so starting with a fraction. Now it's easy to see that the part of the students that liked playing football was 5. However, the total we don't know, but we can see from the circle graph that it tells us the number of kids that liked each of the sports. So if we just add them all together, 20 plus 12 plus 14 plus 9 plus 5, we'll get 60. And so that's our total. 60 kids were surveyed. In this one, we had to add to find our total. Now, if I divide 5 divided by 60 to change this to a percentage, my calculator says 0.083333. So to change to a percentage, I move the decimal point 2 places to the right. 1, 2. In this case, there's a 3 after the decimal point. So maybe I could round this to about 8.3%. It looks like about 8.3% of the students that were surveyed play football. In this example, we can see a circle graph that shows us how many students wanted to adopt student uniforms. So here we can see 1/10 of the students that were surveyed said, yes, we want uniforms. Most of the students, by looking at the circle graph, said no way. And then a few of them did say not sure. So here they're telling us that 1,200 students were surveyed. The question is asking us how many more students said no to school uniforms than yes. We can see that a lot more of them said no, but how many more is what we're trying to find. So we really have two things to figure out. We need to figure out how many students said no, and then how many students said yes. Then we can figure out the difference between these two. How many more said the no than the yes? Okay, so we know that the total is 1,200 students. And we see here that 1/10 of the students said yes to uniforms. That's 1/10 of all of the students. We know that there's 1,200 students. 1/10 of 1,200 students said yes. Well, you remember what of means, right? Of means multiply. Of means to multiply in math. So what I can do is I can figure out what 1/10 of 1,200 students is just by multiplying 1/10 times 1,200 on the calculator. Now you could always change 1/10 into a decimal by dividing, or you could change it into a percentage if you want. But it's pretty quick and easy just to multiply 1/10 times 1,200 in the calculator. So 1/10 times 1,200 is 120 students. So that's how many said yes. Now let's figure out how many said no. So now let's do the no. It looks like 3/5 of the students said no. So let's figure out what is 3/5 of all of the 1,200 students. So we can do that by taking 3/5 times 1,200. Now you could just multiply it using the fraction, or you could change this to a decimal, which would be the same thing as 0.6. 3 divided by 5 is 0.6. So if I multiply this with a calculator, it will tell me that 720 students said no. So here I know that 120 students want school uniforms, 720 school students do not. So how many more said no? How many more is this number than this number? Well, that's a simple subtraction. 720 minus 120 is 600 more students. So here I would have to subtract. And then this would be my final answer. In this next example, you can see here we have a budget plan. So it looks like this circle graph is showing what we do with all of the money that we make. 17% is spent on food. 20% is spent on housing. Let's take a look. Let's say that you make $2,400 in a month. So this circle graph is representing all of the money, $2,400. The graph above shows all of our expenses. How much money is spent on housing and utilities? So my focus here on this one is going to be on both housing and utilities. Here's housing. Here's utilities. Utilities would be like electric and gas and TV and all of those things. Okay? Internet and everything. So we want to figure out how much money is spent on both of them. And so we're really going to be adding those two together when we're all finished. So if 20% of all of my money is spent on housing, I need to figure out what is 20% of all of the $2,400. What is 20% of that? Well, we can change the percent to a decimal. We're just going to back it up here. Of means multiply. So we can figure out what 20% of $2,400 is just by multiplying. The calculator tells me $480 is spent on housing. Then let's find utilities. 13% of our total budget is spent on utilities. So let's find what is 13% of all of our money, $2,400. So we're going to go back it up. 0.13 times 2,400. My calculator says 312. That's the amount of money that's spent on utilities. So now to figure out how much money is spent on housing and utilities, I want to add them together. So housing plus the utilities. That will give me my total. And when I add them together in the calculator, I get $792 total. So that's how you would do a problem like this. In this last example, we can see that 7th grade students were surveyed on what they like to do in their spare time. Here are the activities: sports, reading, video games, and hanging with friends. And just by looking at the circle graph, doing no math at all, we can see that a little over half of the students like to do sports in their spare time. So let's look at the question we're being asked. If 9 students enjoyed playing video games, how many total students were surveyed? So what do we know? 9 students like doing video games. Here's video games, and we can see here that it's 15% of the total, and it represents 9 students. We are being asked how many total students were surveyed. Well, we know that this part is 9, but we don't know how many kids were in each of the other parts. And if we add up all the percentages, we're just going to get 100%. It's not going to tell us how many total. So this one can be kind of tricky, but I know you can figure it out. Let's think about what we know. We know that if we take a part out of a total, that can be written as a percent. We know that we can change that to a percent. So let's think about what we have here. We know the part. We know that there are 9 students out of a total that liked playing video games. But we don't know that total. So I'm just going to put a little empty box here. 9 out of a total. Now, if we were to change that to a percent, those 9 students out of that total that played video games, that is 15%. So we know that 9 out of this total is equal to 15%. Now think about, how could I write 15%? Instead of just writing 15%, could I write that as a fraction? Of course, 15% means 15 out of 100. Now notice what I have here. I have a proportion, and we know how to solve a proportion. If I'm trying to figure out the total right here, I can just change this to an x. 9 students out of a total of how many is equal to 15%. We can use cross products. Let's cross multiply here. 9 times 100, 9 times 100, I put the answer here. And then I take 15 times x, 15x, I bring down the equal sign, and now I have a one-step equation. Now in order to solve this one-step equation, I would divide by 15 and divide the other side by 15 as well. And if I did that, I would get 60. 60 students represents 15% of the circle graph. There's 60 students that enjoy playing video games. So if I go back to my proportion, 9 students out of a total of 60 is equivalent to 15%. So here I would want to use a proportion in order to figure out the total. Okay, that's what makes this one a little bit different than the others. All right, well, thank you for joining me for our lesson on circle graphs. Have a great day.